Thanks. It's a great honor to be here. It's a very unusual gig, and it's very nice to see people coming out in the middle of the week. I hope we can keep you entertained. It's doubly nice to be in an alchemist cafe, because I often tell my students that cognitive science, whatever that is a lot like alchemy rather than one of the better defined sciences like chemistry. Long before chemistry became a respectable science with well-established methods and procedures that everyone agreed on, it was alchemy, and it was a lot more, well, I won't say it was a lot more fun, sorry to all the chemists in the audience, but there was very little agreement. There was a lot of excitement in the air. There were a lot of madcap projects, some of which panned out, so we learned a lot about substances from alchemy, some of which didn't pan out. We never got the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of eternal life. But it was an exciting time to be involved in the business of alchemy, in the business of asking questions in an area where nobody really knew how to ask those questions. So I did say I don't assume that you actually know what cognitive science is, except most of you know it's kind of like psychology. Cognitive science for me is first and foremost interdisciplinary. That means it's an attempt to bring experts from a wide variety of fields together and get them to talk to one another, because experts from different fields are not very good at talking to each other. They're very good at talking within their field, but not so good at talking to people from the next field over. So philosophers have a hard time talking to chemists, who are not so good at talking to physicists, who might have difficulty talking to psychologists, who don't understand the neuroscientists. So cognitive science is about bringing all these people together to try and elucidate the human condition and figure out what brains, behavior, and mind, how these things hook up, what kind of stories we can tell ourselves without making complete fools of ourselves in that area. So, just as with alchemy, the area of cognitive science is relatively young, as alchemy was, and the fundamental issues are far from settled. And so what I'm just going to do in a half an hour or so is try and convey to you why it makes sense to get a lot of experts talking together, what they might talk about, and then some of the ways in which I think science itself might be growing as a result of this enterprise, because the business of getting people to talk together poses problems for the whole scientific enterprise, and that makes things really exciting. So the scientific method, most of you will have some idea what the scientific method is. I'm not going to try and define it, but we all know that central to the scientific method is that the stuff we talk about be reasonably objectively verified. So science is about reaching consensus in a non-opinionated fashion. We use instruments to measure things so that we can refer to those measurements and agree on what was measured. That's objectivity, and it's a central part of science, and it has been as long as the scientific method has held sway. Before the scientific method became generally accepted, of course, you got by in argumentation through bluster and rhetoric and appeal to authority and simply looking knowledgeable. In some ways, not much has changed, but objectivity these days is greatly valued within science. In fact, without objectivity, you might say there is no science. That's wonderful, and this might surprise you, but it's actually not that easy to say what it means to be objective, other than to come at questions in ways that garner consensus and that allow us all to agree, irrespective of our individual beliefs. Objectivity has sometimes been defined as being the mind-independent set of facts. That which is true, irrespective of what anyone believes, what anybody cares about, what anybody thinks. So mind-independent, that which is true, irrespective of your mind or my mind, and your opinion or my opinion. If we can establish a basis if we can discuss the issue at hand using facts which are mind-independent, we can reach consensus, and there's no need for us to fight. It's a very, very useful thing. But that leaves one very serious problem, and it's a problem that no amount of tinkering can fix, because it's a fundamental problem. The subjective is ruled out herewith. Experience, that which it is to be to see the world from a first-person point of view is by definition not objective. And yet, we quite probably care about the subjective, or we may care about the subjective. If you think we don't, then just imagine the following. You're dead. Now what's the world like? Well, basically it's pretty much the same world it was before, except that your bubble of experience is gone. And while that may not matter to most of the world, it sure as hell matters to you. There's not much there if you're dead. Each of us lives in this world of experience. Each of us has something like present experience, which is what it is to be alive, to partake in life, and it matters to us. And the way science is defined, we have great difficulty asking questions about subjective experience. Now, bear in mind, I don't mean experience of the kind you put down in your resume, as was just trotted out, something that is in the past. By experience, I mean that which is happening to you right now, that which characterizes your point of view, your way of looking at the world. So, science has come a long way. Science is brilliant. Science is great, but it's at its best when it's talking about how inert, or things that are not alive, how they move. That's possibly our best science. We can send a piece of metal the size of a school bus up to Mars and get it to land with reasonable accuracy. We're brilliant at that kind of thing. And yet, this wonderful edifice cannot talk by design about subjective experience. It turns out to be very difficult to actually talk coherently about subjective experience, and I'm probably going to tie myself up in knots here trying to do so, because language itself is something with which we use to establish consensus. Language necessarily is something that moves between people, and therefore is only of use if we can agree on something. If we can't agree, we might as well be speaking different languages and not communicating. And yet subjective experience is about that which is particularly, specifically you right now. So it is, almost by definition, also incommunicable. So here we are trying to F the ineffable. What a mess. Well, I'm not the first one to notice this. Back in 1879, the world's first experimental psychology laboratory was opened in Leipzig. And around that time, in the 1870s, the physical sciences were growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, the number of the fundamental discoveries, every week a new fundamental discovery, fantastic theoretical breakthroughs. There was the belief with science, any question that can be well posed, we can pose, and we're clever enough to figure out a way to answer it. And so psychology was born as a way of coming at experience and trying to ask rational, objective questions about experience, about the subjective. And initially, they tried everything in the book. Some of the methods that were established back then are with us today. Some have fallen by the wayside. So the method of introspection has been discredited, so just looking inside and trying to figure out what's going on in your experience by looking inside and reporting on it turns out to be notoriously unreliable. And for a while, psychology went down this road in order to prove its scientific credentials, to prove it wasn't just making up stuff and telling pretty stories. They looked very closely at how we behave, and they didn't talk about minds at all. They talked about behavior and observables in an attempt to be very scientific. And while that was very scientific, it also left experience out of the question entirely. But psychology had been born in the hope of being able to develop the means to talk about experience, to talk about what it is like to be someone at a particular moment. In fact, William James, one of the very first psychologists, he was the guy who gave us that notion of the stream of consciousness, which seems to have fired up so many great literary imaginations. So James Joyce among them, for example. And in stream of consciousness, we get this sense of being inside a person, of the constant flow of experience from a first-person point of view. While it worked very well for literature, it didn't do so well in science. Now, the behaviorists, as I said, kind of went out of fashion because everyone agreed that this is not doing a good job of figuring out how the richness of experience, the wealth of experience, that which it is to be alive, how that all comes to be and how we can talk about it. So psychology then changed, And for the next 50 years or so, the dominant metaphor, and one that still lingers on in the way most journalists talk about these things, was that the brain was the mind, which was some kind of a computer, and we were sort of all information processing devices with inputs through our senses and outputs in our movements and so on. And computers were just new and very powerful, and they told us an awful lot of things, but it turns out they're not such good models of people. And they're not good models of experience. They're really not good models of experience. And I just introduced a fundamental linguistic problem here. I talk of minds and I talk of experience, and I haven't distinguished between the two. There's a third word as well, consciousness, which I don't even want to go there. These words are very, very difficult to use in a fashion that we can all agree on. Experience, I think you'll agree, is not something you can find in the world. It's that which gives you the world in the first place. Experience is that which makes a world for you as long as you're alive. When you're dead, there's no experience. There's not your phenomenal world. The world that you experience is no longer there. Objectively, perhaps there's a world going on, but if you're dead, that experience of yours is no longer there. So experience, rather than being something you can find in the world, is something that gives you a world in the first place. Now, the mind that psychology worked with for a long time, using the computer metaphor, is sort of a thing that you find in the world. And what they did was they stuffed all the mystery into the brain. They laid an awful lot on the poor old brain and the nervous system. Now, neuroscience is an area that looks at brains. And you think they should be able to tell us something about this, but neuroscience deals with brains. It doesn't deal with experience. Neuroscience deals with brains, and brains are fatty kind of meat that are found inside skulls. The language we use has encouraged us to think of the inside of our head as a very special place. If you open it up, what you find inside is something you can kick or squeeze. It's wet brains. You don't find minds inside heads. You don't find minds anywhere. Brains have a very special role to play in all this. But neuroscientists who study brains and nervous systems need some way of interpreting what they're seeing. Now, typically what they've done is they have interpreted the findings of what the brains are doing in terms of the kind of terms that psychologists use, talking about things like memory and perception. And that's fine if psychology would only stay still, but as I pointed out, psychology keeps changing its term of reference as well. So neuroscience, while it's brilliant at talking about brains, it's not that much of a help on its own in talking about experience. So maybe experience is just something we shouldn't really care about as scientists. Well, psychiatry should disabuse us of that notion. In particular, the business of dealing with people who are intensely suffering, subjectively suffering, and very often regarded as mad, to use a very old-fashioned word. Madness, or psychosis as it's commonly called these days perhaps, used to be regarded as a form of possession, and that wasn't a very good model. I think we can all agree possession is not a good way to deal with people who are suffering. And then the model of somatic or bodily illness was applied, and that's the model that's most current at the moment. But if any of you have much experience of psychiatry, it's not a very good model either, and most psychiatrists, if they're honest, will own up that psychiatry still needs a fundamental theory in order to come at experience and hence to come at suffering afresh. So I contend experience is not something we can afford to ignore. When suffering is involved, we do care about it, and we care deeply about it. So we've got psychologists on the job, we've got neuroscientists on the job, we've got psychiatrists on the job, or hoping someone else is going to do the job. They're not the only ones who have cornered the markets, the various markets in experience. So the psychoanalysts have been around for 100-odd years and have yet to reach scientific respectability, but they've also refused to go away because they developed theories of experience which are rich and meaningful and thoroughly unscientific, but clearly they're addressing a need there somewhere. So we need to bring them into the fold. Of course, there are philosophers. There's a small little club of philosophers who deal specifically with experience. They're called phenomenologists, but I'm not allowed to curse. Don't try read them. My God, anybody read Heidegger or Husserl? Ow, ow, ow. When you start talking about experience, you end up reinventing language, and that's what these guys do from the start. And then, oddly enough, there's one last group of specialists who exist in various strands of Eastern philosophy, oddly enough, within various forms of Hinduism and Buddhism. Not the religious elements thereof, but there are long-standing academic traditions of asking pointed, hard questions about the nature of present experience within these traditions, and asking not in a reverential way, asking in a cheeky, come on, prove it kind of way, in almost a scientific way. Happily, these days, there's actually very fruitful conversations going on between psychologists, neuroscientists, Zen Buddhists, and philosophers, which is perhaps interesting to see. So that's all the kind of people who are working in experience, working to come up with a way of talking about that which science has such a hard time talking about, and to do so well. We've developed new tools, though. First of all, we're finding ways to talk across the divide. And cognitive science, my own bastard discipline, is precisely this. It's a way of trying to enable conversations across the divide and to find language that works for people from different specialities. Some of this is natural language of the kind I'm using now, and some of it is mathematics, because there are mathematical theories that simply find applicability, whether we're talking about physics or biology or indeed the science of experience. So we've got some new tools there, which is wonderful. And so, what are we seeing? I can only give you the slightest flavor of what we're seeing, but I can tell you that there seems to be a growing recognition of the fact that the view that the entire mystery of the universe, that last frontier, is in the skull, is not sustainable. Equating brains with minds is not something you can do lightly these days, and it's something a lot of people, myself included, reject outright. The mystery, in other words, is in the whole shebang. It's in the world that you encounter as well as in that piece of meat that's in your brain. Now, in this recognition, what we've come to realize is that there's been a tragic split between mankind and nature. It's a split that's as old as the hills, and the more we focus on that which makes us special and different from animals, the faculty of reason, the more we've emphasized the fact that we stand above nature. The very fact that we have the concept of nature as something distinct from man is an old idea, and it's a fundamentally flawed idea. It's something we really need to get over if we're going to understand ourselves, because we are natural phenomena. We were not assembled by some superhuman race as an artificial product. We are essentially animals. So our continuity with the animal kingdom, the continuity with all of biology, is something that has come to the fore. More and more we're realizing that to focus on that which makes us so distinct doesn't really get at what we are and who we are. So we've already built computers that can play chess better than the best chess player in the world. But you know what? They can't order a beer. They can't go outside and catch a bus. They can't write a poem. They can't talk. They're very good at playing chess, but it turns out playing chess wasn't that interesting. That was just a puzzle. And it wasn't that hard to make a computer that could do it. Making a computer, or an artificial machine that can walk down the road, turns out to be much harder. And we got there as well, but walking is seriously difficult. So one thing that we've come to realize is that not only are we not distinct in an abstract sense, we are embedded in the worlds that we inhabit in a very, very rich and direct fashion. There is no split. So the world that is revealed to us in experience comes about because of a long history of evolution. It comes about because we have sensory apparatuses of a particular kind, because our bodies are of a particular size, because we live at a particular spatial scale, at a particular time scale. This is why we encounter the world that we encounter. So the world we encounter is not something separate, fundamentally separate from us. It's something that partly defines us. And we were understanding this for both animals and humans, the human animal. We're understanding how the environment in which an organism lives co-determines the organism. The environment determines the organism, and the organism determines the environment. They have a mutual relationship which is inescapable. They are not separate from one another. We've also come to realize that in order to understand the first thing about brains and nervous systems, you have to figure out what they're in. They're in bodies, and those bodies matter just as much. Bodies are incredibly important. Nervous systems make no sense without bodies. So nervous systems are embedded, they are part of bodies, and an awful lot of what we think of as smart or clever resides not in nervous systems, but in nervous systems in bodies that are suitably matched to their environment. There's been a lot of lessons learned from robotics, from the job of building artificial systems, artificial cognitive systems, where the most successful approaches are the ones that have not focused on trying to build artificial brains or controllers, but rather on making smart joints, smart muscles, smart limbs, physical structures that are well matched to the world in which these artificial creatures are expected to operate. So putting six legs on so that when you lift up a leg you don't fall over makes you robust, for example. It's a solution nature came up with, and it's one that roboticists have had to discover for themselves. One last thing is that an emphasis of psychology since 1870 has been very much on the psychology of the individual. That is, we've been trying to understand what makes one person tick. There's always been strands of psychology that have looked at our social nature, our collective constitution, if you will, the ways in which we constitute the environment for each other. That is coming to the fore the more we realize how continuous we are with all of nature, how richly embedded we are in the worlds in which we operate. It becomes clear that we need to back off a little bit and realize that very much those things that we value about ourselves, our understanding of ourselves, needs to fully acknowledge this social constitution. To be a human is to be an extremely social animal. Our sociability, we don't exist without our sociability. The human is is an incredibly social animal. So we are partly collectively constituted. We will never have a full answer for what goes on inside an individual without considering all the other individuals in a person's environment with whom one is interacting. So we are partially collectively constructed, and we really need to understand this. And in fact, the more we've studied within psychology, a lot of study has been in decision making, where it turns out we're not nearly as rational as we think, and decisions are made for reasons that we know nothing about, but we're very good at coming up post hoc with rationalizations for our decisions. We're also, unfortunately, terrifically aware of the way in which situations dictate our behavior and our being. So the infamous Stanford prison experiment, which had an unfortunate replication in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Baghdad, for example, shows us just how much a situation can completely determine how the people function within that situation, and to a large extent, who they are for that time. So we are not the autonomous, rational creatures we take ourselves to be. We are continuous nature. We are deeply social. We create the situations that then co-determine our behavior, and we form part of our environment. I mean, we form the environment for each other. So these are just some of the ways, I suppose, that cognitive science is moving, and some of the stories that are coming out of it. And sometimes, occasionally, if you mention that you're a scientist and you're interested in studying experience, people kind of go, could you not leave us one thing? You know, you scientists, you're trying to take the mystery out of everything. You know, we like rainbows, and then you go and tell us, you draw diagrams with lines and equations, and I don't like that. I like rainbows. Are you not taking the mystery out of things? Well, as a scientist, I've never understood the scientific story about rainbows anyway, and as a scientist, I love rainbows as much as anybody else. And our experience, I think, in every field of science has been that as we learn to formulate better questions, we don't reduce the mystery. If anything, we increase the mystery and we increase our appreciation thereof. I see no sign that anything else is going to happen as we learn slowly to introduce science to include subjective experience and to feel our way forwards to finding a language, to talking coherently about our subjective experience. We will learn more about ourselves, but not in a way that sucks the life out of anything, not in a reductionistic sense, but in a way that leaves us more full of mystery than we were before. So I think that's what I have to say. And so you tell us what we're doing.